Hey everyone, welcome back for some more Standard here on MTG Arena. And today I'm showcasing an archetype that has kind of flown under the radar or hasn't gotten that much attention. This is Golgari Midrange. Not Golgari Roots, not Golgari Combo, just pure value Golgari Midrange. Golgari Midrange has been an established archetype in Magic for such a long time. There have been so many variations of this deck. And really, before rotation happened with Edge of Eternities, Golgari Midrange was a fairly strong deck with Glissa Sunslayer and Archfiend of Dross. Terra Sunder was a good flexible piece of interaction as well. So even though Golgari gained some strong pieces like Ouroboroid or Maelstrom Pulse, right, being printed in Foundations, there were some things that were lost, and I do think those losses weakened this color combination to an extent. And that's why it hasn't really been that relevant in the meta for quite a while now. But of course, with the release of Avatar, this color combination has gained some additional pieces. So let me start talking about the deck here that you see in front of you. This has taken quite a long time for me to figure out, and you might be thinking that this looks a little bit different from some other Golgari mid-range lists that you might have seen. So I'm going to explain the approach that I took to the deck and why I'm running the cards that you see and not some other ones that might be missing. Let me just start with the three obvious, mana producing creatures here, right? The typical package of Gene Pollinator, Llanowar Elves, Badgermore Cub, right? These three creatures have seen so much play together in so many decks: Green, Simic, Bant combo, other Golgari decks, right? They're just everywhere. But you'll notice that I'm only running 2 copies of Gene Pollinator instead of the usual 4. I tried 4 for a while, and much to my surprise, it didn't work as well as I was expecting. I think part of the reason is because, yes, there's some big things that you can ramp into here, like Ouroboroid, Unholy Annex, but generally speaking, this curve is kind of low. That's the approach that I took to this deck. I'll talk more about that in a little bit. But so you're not getting this really big payout for having tons of mana available, right? Between the Gene Pollinator, the Elves, and the Badgermore Cub, right? Having effectively 12 of these, 12 because including the Earthbend and Land, right? It wasn't really providing the same amount of value that I thought it would. Not only that, in the games where I had a Gene Pollinator, but I didn't have a Badgermore Cub, the Gene Pollinator really wasn't providing that much value then. I would just play it and it's like, okay, well now on my next turn 2, I can't tap it for mana yet. And if I didn't have a 2-drop that I could play, there's a lot of 2-drops in here, but what if I just had like a piece of removal or I was waiting to like cast a 3-drop? It's like, well, now I'm not ahead on rate. I'm just casting my 3-drop on turn 3 anyway. So I instead brought down the Gene Pollinators to only 2 copies to make room for some other stuff. And I do think that this feels better. The Elves are still really good because this gets you 3 mana on turn 2, right? So now you can cast a 3-drop or you can cast your Annex, right? Any of that stuff. So now you're a little bit ahead. But without a Cub coming down on turn 2, the Gene Pollinator wasn't really providing as much value as I was hoping. Now, as far as the Cub, obviously this is not only the best creature in Avatar, this might be the best creature in Standard right now, period. There's a few things with this. One is that there is potentially a very powerful tempo play that can happen on turn 2, whereby if you have Llanowar Elves or Gene Pollinator on the field, then you play the Cub, now you Earthbend your land, and now you have access to 2 more mana off the Gene Pollinator or the Elves, right? Well, I have so many 2-drops in this deck, so then I'm going to play my Badgermore Cub on turn 2, but then I'm going to play another 2-drop. I'm going to play a Dread Knight, I'm going to play a Demon Wall, or I'm going to play a Deep Cavern Bat. Deep Cavern Bat is really the ideal thing. Just think about it. I have extra mana from Elves or Gene Pollinator. I have another creature from the Badgermore Cub, Earthbending a land. And then now I have played a Deep Cavern Bat. I have a 1/1 flyer with lifelink, and I've taken something. I've exiled something from my opponent's hand. That is just insane tempo in the first 2 turns of the game. It is crazy. I have an Elf, a 1/1 land, the Cub, and a 1/1 bat. Just think about it, right? What would you do if you were an opponent and you saw that on the other side? They just took your best thing from your hand or your removal piece from your hand. They got an Elf, they got an Earthbended land, they got the bat, they got the Cub. That is just crazy, right? So that's why I'm running so many 2-drops though, because turn 2, there's such upside from having the Cub and then casting one of these other strong 2-drops in the Golgari colors, like a Dread Knight, a Demon Wall, or a Bat. But you do need to be very careful with the Cub, because the Cub only allows your creature to tap for an additional green. So if you tap your 2 lands, and then you just have an elf to tap, well, you can't cast your Bat. You don't have access to black mana. So in a lot of games, what I'll do is I'll have one of the lands that make black, so Blooming March, hopefully the Verge is on, right, or a Passage that I've made black, or a Swamp. That's the thing that I'm going to Earthbend, and I'm going to tap the elf to play the Cub. So I'll tap the elf and the other green source to cast the Cub, and then I'm going to Earthbend the black source so that then I can play the Deep Cavern Bat. So you do have to be a little bit careful, right? Make sure that you're tapping your stuff in the right way, because the Cub only allows your creatures to tap for an additional green. So ideally you have one of these 1-drops, right? Gene Pollinator, Land Werewolves, then you go into Cub, and then you play one of these other 2-drops in the first 2 turns. It's a really good start to the game. The 3-drop slot, actually here, you know what, maybe I'll just, maybe I'll just kind of like put these like this so that it's easier to talk about these. The 3-drop slot in the Golgari colors has so many options. You can play Preacher, you can play Karsi Revenant, you can play Sentinel in the Name of City, and all that stuff. So why have I decided to go with Raven Eagle and Surak Elusive Hunter? Raven Eagle, seriously, I said it before at my mono black build, this card is just straight up good. 2/3 flyer that makes a clue token, has built-in graveyard hate, and can either gain 1 life or make your opponent lose 1 life. This is just really good value for 3 mana, and not only that, it counters a lot of the decks in the current meta that use the graveyard, not just Golgari Roots or Sultai Reanimator or the unit decks, but also Izzet Lessons has gotten very popular. That's another deck that uses the graveyard. Orzhov Aristocrats, of course. You know, there are so many decks using the graveyard, and this Raven Eagle just pulls something out of the graveyard as soon as it enters or anytime it attacks. Not only that, the flying is relevant, because if you're going to cast Ouroboroid and buff your whole board, well, it's good to have some flyers that are evasive and get in for damage, right? The other options in the black colors, such as Preacher of the Schism and Karsi Revenant, I don't think they fit in quite as nicely as the Raven Eagle does. Karsi Revenant is a good card, right? It has lifelink, 3/3 flyer, right? You can renew it, so you still get some value when you put it in the graveyard. But the double black on turn 3, it really is a little bit difficult with the Badgermole Cub, because you might be able to ramp into it or whatever, but again, the Badgermole Cub only makes green. And so because of the double black on Karsi Revenant, it really is hard to cast that on rate. Sometimes you just can't cast it on turn 3 or turn 2 or sometimes even turn 4. So that's why I don't have Karsi Revenant in here. As far as Preacher, I talked about Preacher in both my Temur Midrange video and my Mono Black video, and unfortunately, even though Preacher is one of my favorite creatures in Standard, I don't think that he provides the same level of value that he used to, because the meta is just too fast. It's just too fast. Preacher doesn't have an ETB effect. It is a 2/4 with Death Touch. It's an excellent blocker, and it might provide you some more value. Like if you attack with it, you can draw a card or get this 1/1 lifelink token. But really, just playing a Preacher on turn 3, or even playing a Preacher on turn 2, you know, if you ramp into it and just passing the turn, it's really only good value if you're on the play. If you're on the draw, it doesn't really do anything. No trample, no flying. If you make it big with Ouroboroid, it just gets chump blocked anyway. I really do think that as far as the value engine in the 3-drop slot in the black color, the Raven Eagle is the best option. What about Surak Elusive Hunter? So as I said, you know, the other green 3-drop you can play here is Sentinel of the Name of City. It was kind of hard for me to choose between either Surak or Sentinel of the Name of City. One of the things that Surak has that the Sentinel doesn't is Trample. And if you're buffing your whole board with Ouroboroid, you do need to actually get in and finish the game. And the Trample is relevant. If your opponent just blocks the Sentinel, the big Sentinel, with an Otter token, or the Earthbended land with their own Badgermole Cub or whatever it is, then you didn't get in for damage. So that's part of the reason why I'm choosing to go with Surak. But also, Surak has this added value in that he kind of protects your other creatures. Because if you have these other more valuable creatures on the field, like Badgermole Cub, Ouroboroid, or the Demon from the Ritual Chamber, well, if they remove those things, then you're going to draw a card off of Surak, and if you play another thing, you're going to draw a card, right? So the point is that your opponent's attention is going to be drawn to Surak. He's like a decoy. So he's going to bait out a removal spell from your opponent, and then you just draw a card off him. But now you have the space to play these other more powerful things and hopefully keep them a little bit more protected because your opponent just used a removal spell on him. Sentinel of a Nameless City does provide a similar value where it's possible your opponent will be tempted to use a removal spell on it and then not have that removal spell for your other more powerful stuff. But the thing is that you obviously don't draw a card when Sentinel gets removed. It's just gone. And also because it doesn't have trample, then if your opponent just has a 1/1 creature that they don't mind blocking, it's like, all right, well, I'm not going to waste my removal spell on that Sentinel. I'm just going to block it. And then I'm going to save my removal spell for the bigger thing. So because Surak has trample, because it's a guaranteed card draw when he gets targeted or anything else gets targeted, because he can't be countered and all these things, I do think that in this build that is trying to go a little bit big with the Ouroboroid, that's kind of like the end game thing, I do think the Surak provides just a bit more value than the Sentinel. That being said, Sentinel is really good, and I think if you choose to run 2 or 3 copies of Sentinel in the main deck here instead, I don't think there's anything wrong with that. I think it's just a personal preference kind of thing. Now we get to the end game. Ouroboroid and Unholy Annex. Surprise, surprise, we're playing Golgari Midrange. We have 4 Ouroboroids and 4 Unholy Annexes. Who would have guessed that? There's a few things with this though. Obviously, Ouroboroid is just ridiculously strong with Battlecrier Cub. You earthbend this land, you can tap it for extra mana, and then you have your 2 mana from your lands, or you just tap your elves or whatever, and then you can still attack with that land after it's gotten the Ouroboroid buff, or you just go wider by playing Ouroboroid and a 2-drop, right? This is all happening on turn 3. I think we know how this works, right? But this package, right? This package of these 3 green creatures right here, they allow this Golgari deck to just go really fast. And all of a sudden, it's not a mid-range deck. This is an aggro deck that is just getting in there and hitting your face. And look, if you have a Dread Knight on the field as well, Dread Knight has trample. So as Ouroboroid's buffing everything, now you have this trample creature. And that's another reason why I chose to put in the Dread Knight. I'm going to talk a little bit more about this slot that the Dread Knight's in a little bit. The fact that the Dread Knight has trample, the fact that Surak has trample, and the fact that you just have this package here of the usual big, the green accelerators, I guess you can say, this deck can just crush in the first 3, 4, 5 turns of the game. However, I think one of the real appealing aspects about Golgari Midrange is that it can get really aggressive in the form of these green creatures, but it can also just go long because it has all these other things that sustain you through the game. You have an Unholy Annex, you have a Dread Knight that can be used again after it gets removed, you have a Deep Cavern Bat to take your opponent's stuff. It's not just this one-trick pony of, all right, let me make my board really big with a bunch of creatures and just smash. It has this flexibility to adapt in whatever matchup you're playing. There is added synergy here. I talked about this in my mono black deck between the Raven Eagle and the Unholy Annex, because Unholy Annex draws you a second card, so then that's going to trigger the final line of text from Raven Eagle. So your opponent will lose 1 life and you will gain 1 life. It offsets the life loss from the Unholy Annex, so you only lose 1 life instead. But if you have a Demon Wall in play, well, now your opponent's going to lose 3 life off of the Eagle, and you're going to gain 3 life with the Annex and the Eagle as well. Speaking of Demon Wall, this card is really powerful with Ouroboroid, because Ouroboroid comes down, puts a counter on the Demon Wall, and now all of a sudden Demon Wall can attack. And you've got this Y board, you got a Deep Cavern Bat that can attack as well, you got a Demon Wall that can attack, you got an Annex that's going to... You can see what I'm saying here. The Annex also does have a lot of potential with the Battlecrier Cub, because look, sometimes in a single turn, with the mana ramping, you can open up the Ritual Chamber and the Annex in the same turn. That's a little bit hard to do because you need 3 blacks to do that, right? And again, Battlecrier Cub only makes extra green. But even so, if you just open up the Ritual Chamber on turn 3, that is really good, because you got a 6/6 flying demon on turn 3. That's really good value. So for a while, I actually didn't have 4 copies of Annex in here. I actually tried without 4 copies of Ouroboroid as well. I tried with only 3. So I was trying things like LG Acolyte. I was also trying Vivian. I was even trying Luis, Pompous Pillager. And while all those cards were definitely good, especially with the added potential for Void with the Clue token from the Raven Eagle to potentially trigger Void on the Acolyte, and then also the card draw synergy, right, with the gain 1 life and lose 1 life, I was finding that I needed to just be a little bit lower to the ground. I needed a deck that could go fast if I had the right draw, but I also just needed the cards that give good value on rate. The raw value that Ouroboroid and Annex bring while keeping your curve kind of low, because look, Annex is really only 3 mana if you want to do that, And it's so easy to get to 5 mana to open up the Ritual Chamber. And again, a 6/6 demon for 5 mana, that's really good value. But if you can get that a turn or two earlier, you know, you're not waiting until, because you're getting the mana acceleration from the other creatures. Now, Luis is a little bit more interesting. And I will say, Luis is very powerful. Luis is very, very powerful in a Golgari shell now that we have Badgermole Cub. So why am I not playing Luis? There were a few things that I personally didn't want to compromise. I wanted to have the Demon Walls so that there's synergy between Ouroboroid and the Annex. I wanted the 4 Deep Cavern Bats because hand disruption is so important in the current meta, because there's so many decks that do these crazy combos or these crazy things or pop off by turn 4 and all this stuff. But also because of that crazy tempo play that I explained earlier, the Elf or the Gene Pollinator into Badgermole Cub into Bat, all happening by turn 2. It's so much tempo. It gets you so far ahead. And I didn't want to compromise on the 4 bats just because of that, just because of the potential for that specific play on turn 2, because it's that good. So that leaves either choosing between Mosswood Dread Knight, right, or the Luis Pampas Pillager. The reason why I went with the Dread Knight instead of the Luis is, again, just that tiny bit of value, turn 2, playing both Cub and a 2-drop. And one of those could potentially be Mosswood Dread Knight. Or you can cast the Dread Whispers, right? The sorcery adventure. Despite the crazy potential of Luis, you're not going to play Luis on turn 2 for only 2 mana, because that doesn't provide the value, right? So Luis is a card that you have to wait until later to play. Now, you do get a ton of value when you play it, and not only that, if you have an Ouroboroid on the field and you're buffing Luis, that's lifelink, right? So it gets even bigger, you gain more life and all this stuff. That's great. But again, having this early tempo with the Cub and then another 2-drop, and like I said before, the fact that the Dread Knight has trample, and the fact that when it dies you can still get value from it, and the fact that there's synergy between the Dread Whispers and the Raven Eagle, because you draw a card and then they can lose 1 life, you gain 1 life, it offsets the life loss from this, right? All this stuff. I just found that while Luis has much more potential as a powerful card, the Dread Knight is just more reliable. It's just a more reliable slot, creature to slot in here that also fits that tempo play that I'm going for, right? I'm really going for that big tempo play with the Cub and another 2-drop all happening on turn 2 before I get my Ouroboroid, before I get my Surak, before I get my Annex, right? And all that stuff. Also, the potential of Luis here is increased because of mana production, right? But because I'm running 2 copies of Gene Pollinator for what I was explaining before, how much extra mana am I really producing with this deck? Like, how much extra mana am I really producing to be able to chunk my opponent for like 6 damage with Luis, and put 6++1 counters? And what I was finding is that when I was playing Luis, it's like, oh, I can only play X equals 3, or oh, I can only play X equals 4. Like, that's good, but it's not like that good. And then even though Luis can gain you life, it doesn't have trample. So when you attack with it, you gain life, that's great, but your opponent just chumps blocks and then they combo off on their next turn anyway. I'm going for tempo with this Golgari build. I'm not going for big, chunky, flashy plays in the late game. Not only that, Badgermole Cub is all the rage right now, obviously. Every deck that runs green is pretty much playing it, and everybody else is trying to play against it. So with my Cubs, I can't really expect that they're going to stick around that long. And most games, they don't. They get removed a turn or 2 after I play it, or the same turn that I play it. So without Badgermole Cub on the field, how much value are you getting from Luis then? Not that much, because now your Elf, your Gene Pollinator, your Earthbended Land, none of those tap for extra mana anymore. So for all those reasons, I'm not running Luis, not even in the sideboard. It sounds a little bit weird, but again, the tempo and the smoothness from one turn to the next turn, I just found that Luis was not providing the reliable big value that I wanted to see from him. All that being said, if you're a fan of Luis, you're a fan of those big plays, run him in your deck. He's a great card. He fits really well with the mana ramping and all the stuff. And if you see other Golgari lists that run copies of Luis and you want to do that, by all means. Let me talk briefly about the interaction. And what you'll notice is that there's not that much interaction in here, which might seem a little bit weird. A lot of Golgari mid-range decks will have several pieces of interaction. They might have like 8 or 10 or something like that. And I only have 6. The reason why I only have 6 is because I went for a different approach with this Golgari build. I'm going for tempo and for building out a board. So instead of 2 more pieces of interaction, I'm still have the 2 Gene Pollinators. Instead of 2 more pieces of interaction, I'm running the Dread Knights. And it's just because of what I said before, that really good tempo play of the Badgermole Cub and then a 2/2 creature. And not only that, these creatures that come down on turn 2, they synergize with the top end of Ouroboroid and Annex, so they provide some additional value there. Or if you don't do that, you play a 3-drop, or you play your Annex, you play a Surak, you play an Eagle, you play an Annex, and now you're drawing cards. You see what's happening here? So if I ramp into a 3-drop because I have an elf, and if I ramp into a 3-drop on turn 2, the 3-drops are card draw, which is great. So this is a bit of a theme that I was going for here with the 3s. The 3s provide value by potentially giving me more cards. So the 3-drop slot is a bit of a utility slot in this deck, and not running as many pieces of interaction allowed me to kind of take this approach, in addition to having the big potential tempo play on turn 2 with the 8 additional 2-drops in addition to the Badgermole Cub and all this stuff, right? So that's why I only have 6 pieces of interaction, and the ones that I chose are ones that you might expect. Stab. I would never have expected that Stab would become relevant in standard meta, but it just is, because everybody's running Badgermole Cub, everybody's running Drunith in their Simic decks, and everybody's running the Otters and all this other stuff. So the Stab is just really valuable right now. And then I just have the assortment of the other removal spells, Bitter Triumph, Heartless Act, Shoot the Sheriff, right? I like having a flexible assortment of my 2-mana removal spells because they all have drawbacks, right? Bitter Triumph, you have to pay 3 life for discard a card. Heartless Act, they can't have counters on it. Shoot the Sheriff, Outlaws, right? So none of these get everything. Well, Bitter Triumph does get everything, but then you have the drawback. So I find that just having a flexible assortment, it just seems to work a little bit better. You can get around the drawbacks of each removal spell by just playing an assortment of them. Yes, you do run into the potential where it's like, oh, I have a Heartless Act and they have an Ouroboroid and everything has counters on it. Or, oh, they have a Higher Claw and I just have a Shoot the Sheriff and I can't get rid of it and all this stuff. But if you only run copies of Shoot the Sheriff, then if your opponent just plays Outlaws, you can't do anything about it. So if you're holding up a Shoot the Sheriff and you can't kill their Higher Claw, well, maybe you draw the Bitter Triumph that you're looking for. The reverse is true as well. Oh, I have a Heartless Act, but they have Ouroboroid and Drunith and all this stuff. Oh, well, maybe I'll draw into my Shoot the Sheriff instead of only running Heartless Act. The lands are what you would expect, but there's a couple of things with this. One is that if you Earthbend the Restless Cottage with the Badgermole Cub, well, now the Restless Cottage can just attack, and you can exile something from the graveyard and create a food token. So there's excellent graveyard hate in here between the Restless Cottage, the Eagle, right? The Badgermole Cub can potentially animate the Restless Cottage. Then I also have 1 copy of Ba Sing Se. This is a really good card from Avatar. And I'm only playing 1 because tapped green is not good when you have Llanowar Elves and Gene Pollinator that you want to play on turn 1, right? So I'm only running 1, but you could maybe run 2 copies of this. I would not recommend running more than 2 copies though, because you need basic lands, right? They have to be either swamps or forests. And I didn't want to, because of what I was explaining before about the Badgermole Cub only tapping for green, I wanted the Multiversal Passage to be able to give me black, because sometimes you run into these without these, you'll run into these situations where it's like, oh man, I only have a bunch of green. I need more black stuff, to do the other things that I want to be doing. So I can't run as many basics in here because I wanted the full play set of Multiversal Passage. And running less basics means it's more likely that Ba Sing Se can come in tapped, right? But I do think 1 of this, maybe 2, this is really good value. It's good against control decks. It's good against decks that run board wipes or that try to airbend your whole thing or whatever. If you have nothing to do with your mana, then you can earthbend your land, and then that's potentially one that can tap for more mana with Badgermole Cub when you do find something. So this is just a really good card. There have been some nice additions here for Golgari in the Avatar set. The most powerful one being Cub, but some other nice quality of life additions as well, like Raven Eagle, Heartless Act, Ba Sing Se, right? These are just nice quality of life additions for the Golgari colors. Let me talk about the sideboard. There are also some things that you might expect in here. So Intimidation Tactics, Nowhere to Run, right? These are both very good against Kona decks. Nowhere to Run is also really good against Temur Midrange. Bant combo as well. Both of these are pretty good against that deck. Heritage Reclamation, this is what you might expect. Really good in a lot of matchups. And then a copy of Maelstrom Pulse. It might be surprising that Maelstrom Pulse is not in the main deck, The reason why I'm not is because obviously Maelstrom Pulse is a 3-mana removal spell, right? And it's also sorcery speed. Well, let's say I play Badgermole Cup on turn 2. I tap my elf, and now I have, my black Blooming Marsh or my black Swamp, right? So I have a black and a green available with the Cub after I've earthbended that land, right? Well, what if I don't have another 2-drop? What if I don't have Deep Cavern Bat? I don't have Demon Wall, right? Monster Dread Knight. But instead, I'm holding up a piece of removal. Again, tempo. That is just so good. So now when my opponent plays their Badgermole Cub or plays their Ouroboroid, or because Ouroboroid can come down on my opponent's third turn, right? Whatever it is, I'm holding up removal. So 3-mana removal doesn't really fit that tempo. And not only that, it's sorcery speed, right? But that being said, Maelstrom Pulse is a really good addition against the Izzet decks. It gets rid of all the otters. It gets rid of the multiple copies of Storm Chaser's Talon, because there'll probably be more than one copy of that on there. If you're playing against Bant combo and they're trying to like win the game that turn and make a whole bunch of tokens, maybe they don't put the Ang and then they can't, airbend your Maelstrom Pulse, or maybe they do, but then you still have 2 mana, and then you can kill all their 1/1 tokens that they made with Appa, right? And you might not actually die that turn or the next turn or whatever. So Pulse does have its play. I just don't think it's main deck worthy. I don't think it's main deck worthy in the current landscape. 2 copies of Duress and 2 copies of Paw Patch Recruit. These are pretty good against control decks, although it does depend on the if I put the Paw Patch in or not, because your opponent can just wait and then board wipe you after you've played the Paw Patch, right? Now that being said, Paw Patch is a good option to play after a board wipe, but it kind of depends. Am I playing against Azorius? Am I playing against Jeskai? Am I playing against 4-color control, right? It does depend a little bit on when I put the Paw Patch in. I find that Paw Patch is really good against Jeskai control, because Jeskai control doesn't run quite as many copies of Day of Judgment. They'll run copies of Split Up instead, and maybe you can have your 2 untapped Paw Patches if you offspring this and attack with the other thing, and they only get rid of half your board and all this stuff, right? But these cards are also really good against Temur Midrange, right? Temur Midrange is a very interactive deck, and Paw Patch just shuts that down along with Surak, right? That's another reason why Surak is just good. Like, if you're going against Temur Midrange and they're trying to stun your stuff, well, you're going to draw cards off it. More graveyard hate in the form of Strategic Betrayal and an extra copy of Raven Eagle. And then Vivian is in here in the sideboard for those grindier matchups. And she's also really good against control decks too, because she's a little bit harder to interact with. So that is my approach to Golgari Midrange. It's definitely different than other lists you might see. Golgari Midrange tends to kind of go in almost 2 directions. There's one direction where it's highly interactive and has a lot of removal. And then there's another direction that goes like big beatdown, right? And a lot of big stuff or big plays and all this stuff, or lots of creatures. And I kind of took a different line. This is really, at its core, a tempo deck. It's just cards that have good value on raids. There's an outstanding tempo play in the form of Badgermole Cub, and then having another one of these mana producing creatures, and then playing a bat all on the same turn, or just holding up a piece of removal. So I played 10 matches with this deck, and to my surprise, a lot of them actually weren't really that entertaining. I had a bunch that like ended early, or ones where my opponent was roping, or ones where my opponent disconnected, or whatever. But I do have 4 matches to show you, and some of those games in those matches are really interesting. Let's move on to the gameplay. I hope you all enjoy. All right, here's my opening hand for the first game of the first match. And what would you do? What would you do if you saw a hand like this? Because if I draw 1 untapped land, well, hopefully it's something that turns on the Verge or it's a black source, then this hand is great. But if I don't, this hand is kind of bad. I decided to take the risk. I'm on the draw. It gives me 2 draw steps to potentially find the 3rd land. Unfortunately, I didn't just yet. It is another copy of Unholy Annex. But this was a risky keep. So hopefully I can get that land, get the Badgermole Cup down, and then I can start popping off a little bit. My opponent plays a Zao. That is how you say that, right? Zao the Moonslayer. And unfortunately, no land. So just a Deep Cavern Bat, which is a really good card. I can at least use the Gene Pollinator to cast Stab, because I can tap the Verge, right? I can tap the Verge for black mana. My opponent plays an Empire Challenger. No surprise. Mono Red did really get a good addition there in the form of that Zao. It's a good card for them. My opponent's going to attack with everything, and I'm going to use the Gene Pollinator to get rid of that Zao by tapping my Verge. And there's my land. It is Soulstone Sanctuary, which does work. I can play the Cub, animate the Verge, and then I can either cast Deep Cavern Bats or hold up Bitter Triumph, right? Because the Gene Pollinator can tap the cub. It is tempting to hold up Bitter Triumph here because I can just discard one of these Unholy Annexes. You know, I don't need both. I decided to go with the Bat instead. Let me just see what my opponent has here. And Nova Hellkite and Sunspine Links. So that's two pretty scary cards, right? I'm going to at least take the Nova Hellkite so that my Bat doesn't get removed. Now Sunspine Links come down. I can't gain life, and they're going to do 2 damage to me. They're also going to do 2 damage to themselves. I can remove the links with the Bitter Triumph, and again, I can discard one of these Unholy Annexes, right? So that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to discard one of these Annexes, Bitter Triumph the links, and then I do still have mana to cast Ouroboroid. I'm just carefully thinking if I really want to do this, and do I want to hold anything back as a blocker instead, because the back, you know, they have full speed, right? So I'm just kind of carefully thinking, what do I want to do here? And I decided to leave the Badgermole Cub back as a blocker instead of attacking with the Bat, because at this point, I don't actually care if the Badgermole Cub dies. So if I do feel like I want to double block it, then I can double block it with, double block the Bastronaut, I mean. Then I can block with the Cub. I don't mind. The Cub has already provided so much value that I don't necessarily need to keep it around anymore. And my opponent just conceded they could not beat an Ouroboroid. So pretty good, right? I missed a land drop for a turn there, or I guess a couple draws, but it was still fine. You know, again, the tempo play of Badgermole Cub plus Deep Cavern Bat, even though I was a turn behind, still really good. Still, you know, I think was the anchor for me winning that game. I can certainly cut the a couple copies of Annex here. You know, I don't need it if I'm going up against mono red, right? I'm just going to drain my own life. So it does seem better to just put in some more removal, nowhere to run. And it is tempting to put in something like Intimidation Tactics here. But the thing is that with a deck like mono red that is a little bit lower to the ground, you know, doesn't play that many big creatures. It does have Nova Hellkite. It does have the Sunspine Links. But if your opponent, if you're going against a mono red opponent and they have creatures in their hand, they're just going to play those creatures. So you might not get it. You know, you might not get the creature out of their hand with the Intimidation Tactics before they cast it, because they're just going to cast whatever creature they have. Paw Patch Recruit is also potentially good, because if they target your stuff, then you put +1/+1 counters. But look, you're going up against red, they're going to put Fire Magic in, right? So, and to that end, I was also considering taking out the Deep Cavern Bats because of Fire Magic, Nova Hellkite, and all those things. Here's my opening hand for the second game. And at first I was like, oh, this hand is great. You know, I got the Verge, I got an Elf, I got a Badgermole Cub, but I paused for a second here because I don't have access to black. Not only do I not have access to black, but I don't have a basic, so that Bossing Say would come in tapped. So it's actually not as good as I was hoping. You know, again, this is why I'm only running one copy of Bossing Say. You know, I got unlucky that it's in my opening hand, but you know, look, I only have access to green. I can't use my removal spells right now. So this was a hard choice if I was going to keep this or not, because turn 1 Elf, turn 2 Badgermole Cub is really good, but I decided to mulligan it because I wouldn't be able to remove any of their things. And then unfortunately I got an even worse hand that only had swamps, right? So some unfortunate opening hands there, but I do think that mulliganing that first hand was the right choice, because what if I don't get a black source for a few turns? Then what am I going to do? I'm just going to have a Cub and an Elf and no way to interact with my opponent's stuff. Maybe I top deck an Ouroboroid and I go crazy, right? But it just didn't. It felt too unreliable and too risky. So I was debating getting rid of the Shoot the Sheriff here because Hireclaw is an outlaw, right? But then I kind of thought maybe I do want both removal spells, because look, I don't have the good tempo play of Elf or Gene Pollinator into Badgermole Cub and then Deep Cavern Battle on the same turn, right? I didn't have access to that. So instead I just wanted to hold the removal spells, and then I ended up drawing a second Badgermole Cub, right? And then my opponent plays an Empire Challenger. Drawing the Demon Wall actually does make this interesting, because that might be the better thing to do. It just blocks the Empire Challenger. And even if my opponent triggers the prowess on the Empire Challenger, I don't care. I'll trade with the Demon Wall, right? I'll use the Demon Wall to trade. You know, taking out the 2 annexes, the Demon Wall doesn't provide quite as much value. You know, it's not as necessary as it was before. So sure, I'll trade with this Empire Challenger. But they cast a full bore, so much for trading, right? But at least they used the full bore and didn't get much value from it because it only, you know, they didn't get it for damage. And look at that, they found a Hazoret. So this is getting a little bit, I do have the nowhere to runs, so it's good that I sideboarded those in. But it's getting a little bit sketch, right? Because I can't remove the Hazoret until I get a nowhere to run. And I have to try to prevent my opponent from getting up to max speed. So, and they're already at 2 speed. They found another full bore, which I'm hoping that they use because I'm going to remove this Emperor Challenger with Shoot the Sheriff. And they do. My opponent's going to attack. And I will remove it with Shoot the Sheriff. I drew another Baptismal Cub. You know, normally this would be great, right? But I need lands. I need 1 land to you know, kind of like play the elf and the cub. But, you know, look, at this point, even if my opponent plays an Empire Challenger, right, and attacks me, I just wanted to get the cub down. I figured that they were holding a Burst Lightning at this point. So I have 2 other cubs, so be it. Let them use a Burst Lightning on one of my cubs, you know what I mean? So, and then they play a Sunspine Lynx, which only does 1 damage to me. I can't gain life, obviously. And then they also play a Burnout Bastionot. I finally got a 3rd land, so now I actually can do a lot. You know, I can play the cub, and then I could play an elf, or I could play another cub, or I can hold up Bitter Triumph. So I wish I had gotten that land sooner, but I really didn't mind throwing away that that first copy of Baptismal Cub. You know, look, I have 2 more in my hand. So what I'm going to do here is actually a small mistake. I could play the cub and hold up Bitter Triumph, but I'm actually going to play the elf because I'm thinking that I would double block the Bastionot and then use the Bitter Triumph on the Sunspine Lynx. Because look, if I double block with the cottage, it just comes back, right? But I forgot about Hazoret's activated ability, you know, and they used it on the Empire Challenger, but I just forgot. So now the Bastionot can't be blocked, right? So definitely a bit of a misplay on my part. I can't block this Bastionot, and then they're also going to go up to full speed with this, right? So then the Hazoret can attack. My opponent attacks with both creatures, and I'm thinking that I can at least just block the Lynx, and then maybe I'll use the Bitter Triumph on the Bastionot instead. My opponent pumps up the Bastionot, pumps it up again, so they're tapped out. Now I'm really thinking that maybe I should just use Bitter Triumph on the Bastionot, because they're going to keep making it unblockable with Hazoret every single turn, right? And now I'm just deciding, do I really want to pay the 3 life here? Because I will go up to 4, they'll go up to 4 speed. So now Hazoret can attack. I decided yes, because if I just have more cubs, then that's just more chump blockers because I can earthbend more lands. So that's why I did that. And drawing an Annex there is actually good because if I can buy some time to open up the Ritual Chamber, well, now I have a 6/6 creature that can block, right? So I'm going to play the first cub, or I guess the second cub, animate my land. And then I am going to play the second cub. And I'm thinking that I'll just take the damage from the Hazoret. And I'm just making chump blockers with this. And I put the other Earthbend counter on the cottage because now I can double block the Lynx. So I don't care if one of my cubs goes away. And then I'll get back the cottage, obviously, because it's earthbended. So that's why I did that. They play another Sunspine Lynx, unfortunately for me. They attack with both creatures. And I am still thinking that, well, I should probably just double block and I can open up the Ritual Chamber and have a 6/6 blocker. So, I mean, you know, that little misplay that I did with playing the elf to double block the Bastionot, it did set me behind a little bit in this game. Damage goes through. And I drew a Demon Wall. Really good. But I can't gain life is the problem, right? Because the Lynx is on the field. That being said, I am still considering playing it just to start drawing cards off of the Annex. So I won't be able to gain life, but I won't lose life. Obviously, it would be ideal if I could play this Demon Wall and open up the Annex. But because I can't gain life off of the Annex, it didn't feel like it was quite worth it yet. It felt like it would be better to get the 6/6 demon, because then they can't attack me with the Lynx. And they play a Zao. So that actually can potentially be a problem, because if they only need one more mana to put the Conquer counter on him. And if they put a Conquer counter on him, then my non-basic lands, my 3 non-basic lands, they're only going to tap for red, because they're only going to be mountains. So tough spot that I'm in. I am thinking of just playing out my hand, play the Gene Pollinator, play the Demon Wall, make some blockers, right? I also want to open up this ritual or the Annex though, because I want to start drawing cards, because I want to find a removal spell, right? I want to find the Nowhere to Run for the Hazoret, or I want to find a Shoot the Sheriff for the Lynx or something like that. So it's a little bit risky to cast these creatures and not open up the Annex, because I'm going to go it's one less card that I can find, and if they find a 7th land, then my lands are going to be only able to tap for red. My opponent's going to make the Zao unblockable. And they did find a 7th land. So now they're going to attack. I go down to 3. And not only that, because they're at max speed, so I forgot about the Raceway land there. That Raceway land actually taps for 2 colorless. So that's how they were able to put the Conqueror counter on Zao. And now I'm really stuck, right? Because my non-basic lands are mountains now, so they can't tap for any color other than red. Now I do have access to black still because of Gene Pollinator, so I can still open up the Annex, but I'm not going to gain life off it, right, because of the Lynx. And then unfortunately, if I draw a removal spell, I'm not going to be able to play it until my next turn, because Gene Pollinator is my only access to black. So this is a tough spot, right? I'm still going to do it because there's kind of no point in me not doing it, right? I really should open up this chamber. I need to find removal, so I should go 1 card deeper to try to see if I can find it. And I drew a stab, which is good. I can stab the Zao, and if I draw another removal spell, then I can cast that one as well. But I'm going to go down to 1 life, right? Because the Zao is going to be unblockable. So Burst Lightning, Lightning Strike, right, any of those things. But look at what I drew. Nowhere to Run, exactly what I needed. So first I'm going to stab the Zao, and then I can use Nowhere to Run on the Hazoret. My opponent puts a counter on Zao for some reason. That obviously doesn't do anything. Nowhere to Run on Hazoret. So now I'm doing much better, but I'm also still in a tough spot, because Burst Lightning does me in, Lightning Strike does me in. I'm also not going to attack with this demon because they can top deck a Nova Hellkite, and that will win the game for them. So I just have to hold on here. And I'm just looking through my graveyard to see how many removal spells I've used, because I need to find one for this Lynx, and it can't be Nowhere to Run either. It has to be Shoot the Sheriff. It has to be my Heartless Act. My opponent plays a Soulstone Sanctuary, which is relevant. That's another creature that they can use to attack me or to block. I drew an Ouroboroid, so that's actually a pretty good draw, right? At least the Demon Wall can attack, and then if they activate the Soulstone Sanctuary and double block it, then I'll remove their Lynx. But again, man, anything off the top, they don't have it yet, but anything off the top, Burst Lightning, Lightning Strike, any of those things, and I'm just going to lose the game. So +1/+1 counter goes on everything. I'm going to attack with the Demon Wall. They're not going to block. Can I hold on? Can I hold on with 1 life? They activate the Soulstone Sanctuary. And let's see what they top deck. They play a land. They activate the land, and that's it. They didn't have it. So I got really fortunate there that I survived with 1 life, right? But yeah, that was a crazy game. All right, here's my opening hand for the first game of the second match. This does look pretty good. It is unfortunate, though, that it doesn't seem like I'm going to be able to cast everything on rate due to the Restless Cottage. So I do have a bit of a decision to make. Do I want to start with the Multiversal Passage and play the Elf? I'm thinking yes, but I won't be able to cast the Bitter Triumph, right? Because I only have green mana. So I can't really do anything. I just have to kind of hope that my opponent doesn't get off to that strong of a start. And then I find, a bit more lands. And look at that. My opponent had to mulligan down to 5. So unfortunate for them. Obviously good for me. My opponent starts with a Sanctum and a Gene Pollinator. So could be anything, right? I don't really know what it is just yet. And drawing the forest, it would be nice if that was a swamp. But I'm just going to have to pass, play the cottage, and then I can start playing my Ouroboroid. I got 2 Ouroboroids, right? So I'm just going to pop off if my opponent doesn't stop me here. Attacking with the Pollinator, and it's good that they didn't play anything, so now I can just be a little bit off to the races here. Drop an Ouroboroid. Next turn, potentially play a second Ouroboroid. My opponent plays a forest. And they put a stop on my upkeep. And they play an Ang. So this is Bant combo, right? It is not Simic. So they're seemingly going to target my Ouroboroid here. And I drew a stab off the top. So if I play the Soulstone Sanctuary, I do have access to 5 mana. And it would be nice for me to be able to cast the Ouroboroid, Bitter Triumph the Ang, and then stab the Gene Pollinator. Unfortunately, I can't because I only have 1 black source, the Restless Cottage. So instead, it does seem like my best option is to play the Raven Eagle and the Ouroboroid. The other option is to play the stab on Gene Pollinator and then cast the Ouroboroid from my hand instead of the one that's in exile. I decided to go with the Raven Eagle. It can block the Ang once it gets the +1/+1 counter from the Ouroboroid. So at least my opponent can't get in for damage here. And obviously having a big flyer, I'm just going to remove their Ang when I can. And having a big flyer is good. My opponent finally gets a white land, but it comes in tapped. And that's it. Nothing else. Drawing the Dread Knight is a little bit interesting. It is tempting to play the Adventure spell to try to get another land, but it feels a little bit risky. I think just play the stab, do the more reliable line here, right? And then play the second Ouroboroid and just swing for tons of damage. So I'm going to order the triggers so that the bigger Ouroboroid triggers first. Obviously, it makes my creatures even bigger. Exile the Gene Pollinator, get a clue. And my opponent did block, so they're holding on to that Ang to see if they get the Appa and the Dock and all the stuff, right? And that's it. So really strong start for me. Having the Ouroboroid just put me really far ahead. And that's what I was saying in the deck tech. The deck with the green cards can still just go ridiculously fast. I had the Ouroboroid on turn 3. I didn't even have a Badgermore Cup in that game. Had the Ouroboroid and had removal spells. I mean, I didn't even really need them, but it's just kind of crazy how strong green is right now. So I'm certainly going to put in the Intimidation tactics going up against Bant combo. And I'm going to take out the Mosswood Dread Knight because if Mosswood Dread Knight gets removed, normally, then I can recast it for the Adventure spell. But if it just gets exiled, then I'm just going to cast it for 2 mana. You know what I mean? It's not really that much value against a deck like this that's airbending stuff. And then I just have to pay the same mana cost to put it back down on the field, and it doesn't really do anything. So putting in Maelstrom Pulse here in case my opponent does get the combo going with all the 1/1 tokens, but maybe they can't win on that turn, or maybe they don't find an Ang. Maybe they're just doing it with Airbend Ascension, and I can remove all of those tokens with Maelstrom Pulse. So I wanted to try that. Also, just having another removal spell. For what it's worth, the Maelstrom Pulse also does hit the Airband Ascension. That's also why I put in a copy of Heritage Reclamation here to try to get the Airband Ascension. It also, the Heritage Reclamation also does kill Gene Pollinator, for what it's worth, because Gene Pollinator is an artifact. You're probably not really going to do that very often, but you can. Here's my opening hand for the second game. This looks pretty good. And start with Intimidation Tactics. Got a Heritage, Demon Wall, Ouroboroid. Looks pretty good. I drew an Elf, so now I have to decide if I'm going to Tactics or Elves. That's a tough choice, right? Is it better to ramp or is it better to Elf? If I play the Elf, then I can play the Multiversal Passage on black, and then I can play Demon Wall and Intimidation Tactics on my next turn, which seems pretty good, right? So I am kind of considering that. There's not too many scary things that can come down on turn 2. Obviously, there's Dock, but I just have to, hope I get a removal spell. The main thing is disrupting their hand, the more powerful things, right? So there's the Dock. They don't have access to white mana, though. And then I drew a swap anyway, so I'm going to play that. And then I'm going to Intimidation Tactics and play the Demon Wall. So this is already a good curving, a good curve for me. And look, they don't have another land, and they don't have white. So I am thinking of just getting rid of that Appa, because the Ang is 5 mana. And my opponent still missed a land, and I drew a Blooming Marsh, which is good, because that's still going to be untapped. So now I can obviously cast Ouroboroid, but I'm a little bit apprehensive to do that, even though Demon Wall will get a counter on it, just because of what they're holding. They have Get Lost and the Split Up. So like if they play 2 white spells in a row, if they get 2 white lands, they'll remove my Ouroboroid, and then they can just split up and wipe my board. So I wanted to see if I draw a removal spell for Dock, but I think in retrospect, I didn't really need to do that. I think I was playing a little bit too defensively here, even though, Intimidation Tactics is not a bad find. And you'll see they have an Ang in hand, so now I get to exile that. So that actually was good value that I ended up getting. But I just think it was unnecessary. I think I was playing a little bit too defensively there, and it would have been better for me to just be on the offense with my opponent missing lands. So I think it would have been better to just cast the Ouroboroid. However, with me drawing that Annex, I am tempted to open up the Ritual Chamber, because that actually puts my opponent in a tough position. Do they decide to use their Get Lost on my Demon, or do they decide to use Get Lost on my Annex? And either way, then they don't have Get Lost for my Ouroboroid. So that actually was a better way to play around the spells that I know they have. And they just scoop anyway, because they just kept missing lands. So I got a little bit lucky in that game. I think really, though, I didn't need to play as defensively as I needed to there. I could have just played that Ouroboroid and swung for damage. All right, here's my opening hand for the first game of the third match. I started the recording a little late, unfortunately, but look at this hand. This is really good. I got the Elf, the Bat, the Surak, the Ouroboroid. This is just great. And not only that, take a look. My opponent mulliganed all the way down to 4. That's so rough, man. I've been in that situation. It's so rough. I felt really bad, But since they're mulliganing down to 4, look, the best thing for me to do is play the Bat, to take one of their cards, because they have basically nothing, right? So now they're really, I'm going to take that Boomerang Basics. Now they really don't have anything, right? So I it's unfortunate for my opponent, but it's just the way it is. I actually did debate attacking with the Elf there, but it doesn't seem worth it. Just play my Ouroboroid on my next turn. And I drew a swap, so I don't have to pay the shock for the Multiversal Passage. Play the Ouroboroid, attack with the Bat, and then they just immediately concede. Not the most interesting first game, but look, man, sometimes that happens. You mulligan down to 4. I've been in that situation. It absolutely sucks. But so my opponent is clearly playing like some kind of Izzet lessons based deck, right? I'm not sure if it's the Izzet looting, because the Izzet looting runs like Duelist of the Mind, Fear of Missing Out, all those things, but then the Izzet lessons that's a little bit slower won't play those cards, and will instead just play tons of lessons, and then just some of those creatures that get cheaper based on the number of instant sorceries or non-creature spells in your graveyard, right? So I'm not sure which one I'm playing against yet, and that does affect how I'm going to sideboard. I'm going to put in the Heritage Reclamations for the Storm Chaser's talents. It could also potentially get Fear of Missing Out if they're playing Fears of Missing Out. And Maelstrom Pulse. Maelstrom Pulse will kill the otters. Maelstrom Pulse will kill the multiple copies of Storm Chaser's Talons if they have more than one on the field. Now I need to decide what to cut. I mean, Deep Cavern Bat doesn't feel that good in this matchup because they're definitely going to sideboard in Fire Magic. And they also probably have like Torch the Towers or the new lesson that does 2 damage. I forget which one that is. And the 1-mana one. So my bats are probably just not going to survive, right? So now that, especially now that I'm on the draw. On the play, you know, a little bit different, but... And I decided to put in a copy of Strategic Betrayal just for a little bit more graveyard hate, because if they are playing lessons, which they could be, then I'm going to want to exile all those lessons from their graveyard, right? And not only that, I mean, look, Storm Chaser's Talent interacts with the graveyard. You get something back. They get back their Boomerang Basics. That is the combo, right, with the Izzet deck. Boomerang Basics and Storm Chaser's Talent. Here's my opening hand for the second game. This does look good. I'm probably going to start with the Duress, but then I can have Gene Pollinator, right, or Ouroboroid, potentially. So let's see what my opponent has. Pretty strong opening hand for them. And unfortunately, you know, if I make them discard a lesson, then it puts a lesson in the graveyard, right? And you can clearly tell that this is Izzet lessons. It's not the Izzet looting, because there would be cheaper creatures in there, and instead there's just the big creatures that get discounted based on what's in your graveyard. So, I'm going to get rid of the Wisdom just because it's their card draw, right? 2 mana draw 3 is insane. So... And with me drawing a Badgermole Cub and they have the Firebending lesson, I decided to play the Gene Pollinator to see if they take the bait and they use the lesson on it. And they did. So now I can cast Badgermole Cub and it might not get removed as easily. They play a Storm Chaser's Talent. And that is a little bit scary because next turn they get to 4 mana and they can just pull the Firebending lesson out of the graveyard. So for that reason, I'm going to play the Badgermole Cub, and I'm actually debating using this Heritage Reclamation on that Storm Chaser's Talent because I don't want them to get back either the Wisdom or the Firebending lesson. And I'm just reading the Serpent of the Past to see what it says. It says, this spell costs 1 less to cast for each non-creature, non-land card in your graveyard. So that includes Storm Chaser's Talent, unfortunately, right? So now I'm thinking maybe I don't kill the Storm Chaser's Talent, remove it with the Heritage. Maybe I just pull one of those lessons out of the graveyard with the Heritage instead, because otherwise they'll be able to cast that guy. They can cast that guy next turn if I put the Storm Chaser's Talent in the graveyard. Tough situation, right? I decided to destroy the Storm Chaser's Talent, and if they cast that guy, I can just shoot it with Shoot the Sheriff anyway. So that's why I decided to do that. But I was kind of hoping to save the shoot, or the crab, because the crab is slightly worse because it taps down my guys and they can balance it with Boomerang Basics and keep doing that over and over again. So tough choice, right? I also, look, I didn't hit a land here. So now if I had a land, I would be able to cast that Raven Eagle and to Shoot the Sheriff. So unfortunately, in a bit of a tough spot, right? I'm actually thinking I should just cast one of these Ouroboroids because if I get a land, then I can play the Eagle and to Shoot the Sheriff. You know, they're not going to kill me next turn, right? I can just use my life total here as a bit of a resource. I don't have to kill that Serpent right away. But I am apprehensive because I don't want them to be able to play that Crab. See, the Crab, if they draw a land, they can play the Crab, they can tap down 2 of my guys. I'm in a tough spot, right? So I'm actually thinking maybe I should play this Eagle to exile a lesson from their graveyard, which would probably be the Wisdom at this point, because I don't want them to draw cards out. Well, I guess it could be Firebending lesson because it can kill my Cub, but really tough situation, right? None of these options are particularly good. However, the one that potentially has the most upside for me is probably just playing Ouroboroid. But the other lines slow my opponent down to hopefully get my land, right? So I decided to go for the Eagle, exile the Wisdom. There's an argument to be made that I get rid of the other thing, the Firebending lesson instead. But if the Eagle attacks, then you know I can get rid of the lesson. And look at that, they did find a 5th land, so they would have been able to cast the Crab. So, and then I drew another Badgermole Cub. So with another Badgermole Cub, I unfortunately can't Shoot the Sheriff and Ouroboroid, but I can play Cub and Shoot the Sheriff, which I'm kind of debating doing. And then if I attack with the Eagle, I can exile the Firebending lesson, right? So that's what I'm considering here. I'm also considering just putting the counter on the Verge again, right? To have that be a 2/2. But I decided instead just go wide. You know, if I have Ouroboroids lined up and ready to go, then it might be better to just do it this way. So my opponent plays an Iddlequentia in response. So I unfortunately cannot remove the Serpent. And I am going to attack with the Eagle though, and then I can exile a Lesson from the graveyard, which I'm thinking Firebending Lesson is better here. But if they draw a 6th land, then they can cast a Crab. They're attacking with the Serpent. And they did not get a land. And I found an Unholy Annex, which is good. I can open up the Ritual Chamber, which I am debating doing. It's a little bit better on rate than just casting an Ouroboroid. And the Eagle can still attack. I can still exile something from the graveyard. But they have Detect Intrusion, so they're going to counter my Ritual Chamber trigger. So they're really holding their own here, you know? And again, if they get a 6th land, I can get rid of the Iddlequentia, but if they get a 6th land, they can cast a Crab. They're really holding on here, and I don't really have too many options that I can do, right? Now, at least I've exiled everything from their graveyard except for the Detect Intrusion. They're going to get it back, but I can play the Ouroboroid. I can open up the Annex. I have another Ouroboroid, right? So maybe that Detect Intrusion won't be so bad. It did feel like I needed to block here, though, because, look, I have 12 life. This is an attack for 8, and you know, is the Cub providing more value at this point? You know what I mean? Like, it's a bit of a tough, like, how much value is that Cub really providing now when I can just, like, get a 4th land and then play Ouroboroid? Now, I didn't get a land, unfortunately, which would be really good if I did, because then I could play the Dread Knight and the Ouroboroid. So this game's been a little bit tough for me. I'm not really too sure about what to do, but I can at least attack with the Eagle. I can exile the Storm Chasers down from the graveyard, which doesn't really do anything. You know, they can't really find a way to pull it out. But I am debating opening up the Annex and then leaving back one of the Verges as a blocker, because they can't play Detect Intrusion right now. So they will not be able to counter my Annex. The other option is to tap all the lands I have and then play the Dread Knight and open up the Annex, which also might not be bad because the Dread Knight can block and then I can still potentially use it, right? So, but my opponent had a really unfortunate first game, and they're really holding on right now in this game. So it's definitely an interesting match. I decided to go for the Dread Knight, and I didn't open up the Annex because I wanted to leave the Verge back as a blocker, so I can block an Otter and I can block the Serpent. I also wanted to play the Dread Knight so that I could have the option to do this, right, to double block with it, since they only attacked with that one creature. And now if I draw a 4th land, then I can play Ouroboroid. So I did draw a 4th land, but I'm going to go down to 2 life. I'm still thinking that might be the right line. So I'm also thinking maybe I just pay this tapped, and then I leave my lands back as blockers instead. So that's the other thing that I wanted to consider here, and I end up going with that. I think that's the right choice. Leave the lands back as blockers since they come back, right, when they die. I'm going to exile. I probably should have exiled the Detect Intrusion there. I'm not sure why I exiled the Serpent. But I'm going to leave the Clue token. If they don't attack, I can activate it and draw a card. And they did draw a land, but it comes in tapped. And I drew a Booming Marsh and another Dread Knight. So I am also holding on, right? But it's still, I'm still not sure if it's a good idea for me to play this Ouroboroid, because Ouroboroid and the Eagle are going to be my only blockers. It really feels like it's better for me to leave back the lands as blockers. So I'm thinking just play this Dread Knight, right? Just play this Dread Knight, have it as a blocker, have my lands as blockers, exile the Detect Intrusion. Tough match, man. Isn't it? This is so cool, though. This is such a cool match. I mean, the first game, again, unfortunate that my opponent had the mulligan before, but this is so interesting. They play an Abandoned Attachments. Get rid of an Iddlequentia. So now there's 2 lessons in the graveyard, right? And they play a combustion technique. So there goes my eagle. There goes my graveyard hate, unfortunately. I can take one of these otters, but they have an accumulate wisdom, so their otter is going to survive. So this felt like the turning point. You know, I might not be able to come back now because they have too many things in the graveyard, and they can just tap down my creatures with the crab, right? So, barring some miracle, it doesn't feel like there's a single thing in my deck that I can draw at this point. I just drew a duress. That's not going to do it, right? So even if I play Ouroboroid, even if I draw a card off the Dread Knight, it doesn't matter because they can just tap down my 2 creatures with the crab, right? So I wanted to play duress just to see what's in their hand, but it's irrelevant. You know, they also have boomerang basics, fire melee. It's just, you know, it doesn't matter. So unfortunately, that is the game for me. But really interesting, right? That was a really interesting game. It was much better than the first one, which ended so abruptly. So now that I have a better, have some more information about my opponent's deck, I'm considering changing the sideboard a little bit because they don't have the small creatures from the Izzet looting. So I'm debating, should I put in the eagle, the 3rd eagle? Should I put in the 2nd strategic betrayal? I wasn't sure. It felt like maybe no, because I'm on the play now. So I do want to be aggressive instead of sitting back with more interactive spells. But there's an argument to be made for that. You know, there's an argument to just play more graveyard hate because they're playing a lessons deck, right? Which the graveyard is such an important aspect of it. But I decided to just keep what I had. Here's my opening hand for the 3rd game. It's not great because I only had access to green mana and I didn't really have any early spells. And this hand is also not that great, but I can at least duress and hold up removal. But waiting for an Ouroboroid, you know, that's going to be my only creature. So I just have to hope for some good draws here, right? This hand is a little bit better than the other one because the other one only had green and I couldn't really do anything. But so my opponent's hand is a little bit loaded. They have Storm Chaser's Talent, Idle Quencha, Fire Magic, Accumulate Wisdom. So, you know, obviously if I take away the Storm Chaser's Talent, that's like their turn 1 play, right? But it actually felt like maybe I should get rid of something else. Like maybe I should get rid of the Idle Quencha because they're just going to counter my Ouroboroid if I try to play that, or they're just going to counter whatever big thing I try to play, right? So I actually decided to get rid of the Idle Quencha, and I'll just try to deal with the Otter. You know, maybe the Otter is not so bad. And now I'm actually thinking that I'm just going to destroy that Storm Chaser's Talent before they can do anything with it, but I didn't actually have to do that. You know, I could have waited. The only thing that would stop me from removing it is another Idle Quencha, because Boomerang Basics is just sorcery speed, right? So I didn't actually have to do it on my turn. I could have waited for my opponent's turn. I'm going to play this Multiversal Passage tapped. It's both fortunate and unfortunate that I drew a land, because I need the 4th land to cast Ouroboroid, but I also need to start building a board. So my opponent's going to attack with the Otter. I'm just going to be a little patient here and take the damage. And they didn't play anything, so they missed a land. So I'm going to get rid of that Otter because this is all they got, right? They just have they have 2 lands. They're seemingly going to need to cast the Accumulate Wisdom to try to get another land, and they have a Detect Intrusion. So not so bad, because if they're going to, you know, if they're going to detect something, it's better that they do it on that instead of one of my more powerful cards. I did debate actually playing the Strategic Betrayal, but with my opponent missing lands, it felt like I should just get Ouroboroid on the field, right? They did get their 3rd land now, but they're probably not. If they get another Otter, so be it, from another talent. I can still exile the graveyard. And they attack here, I'm certainly not going to block because they can Fire Magic, and then my Ouroboroid will die. Because the Otter will prowess and then 2 damage to my Ouroboroid as well from the Fire Magic. So now I'm going to cast Strategic Betrayal. Get rid of all that stuff. Ouroboroid gets even bigger. And this is really good because now Ouroboroid is basically outside the range of the combustion technique, especially if they have to get so many lessons in their graveyard. But they can boomerang it. And they can boomerang it back to my hand. But nothing from my opponent there, and nothing from me either. I just drew a land. But I can at least play the Restless, or activate the Restless Cottage. I know we'll get counters on it from Ouroboroid. Before that happens, they're going to play a firebending trigger, and seemingly they're going to fire magic here, right, to get rid of my cottage. And it is what they did, so they'll get rid of my cottage. But Ouroboroid gets even bigger. The plant is just growing here. And they pass the turn. I draw a second Ouroboroid. So I don't know what they have, right? But hopefully with 2 Ouroboroids, I'm obviously going to trigger the bigger one first, right? Trigger the bigger one first so they both get huge. And then swing. And they didn't have anything. So the second game was really interesting, right? First and third game, not quite as much. But interesting match overall, right? Against the Izzet Lessons here. All right, here's my opening hand for the first game of the 4th match. It's pretty good. It could be better, but 2 bats is certainly not a bad thing, right? But I don't have any mana ramp. It was a little tempting to mulligan this actually, which might sound a little weird, but because it's just slow, right? If I'm going up against a fast deck, well, I guess it's not that slow with the bats, but I was worried about being on the draw against a slower deck. But look at that, my opponent mulliganed down to 5, so not a good start for my opponent, unfortunately. They play an Esper Origins, so it could be some kind of green ramp deck, but it's actually not. It's Temur Battlecrier, hence the Temur Battlecrier in the graveyard, right? And it seemed like they were probably trying to find a land, and they were, because they only have they don't have a 3rd land in hand. So I'm going to take the Trailblazer, and they still might not have found a land because they just play the Esper Origins. So they actually put a land in the graveyard, which I was very confused about, and then they didn't play a land. So seemingly there might be another land there underneath that one that they wanted to keep instead. But I found that a little bit strange. Maybe there's just another land underneath that they wanted to keep, but then I just take their second Temur Battlecrier and they just concede at that point. So a rough start for my opponent, right? A good start for me, but I can certainly take out the stabs. The only thing in their deck that it hits is Llanowar Elves. Put in the Intimidation Tactics instead for the combo pieces. Put in Nowhere to Run. It gets rid of Trailblazer. It gets rid of Temur Battlecrier, right? All those things. Mosswood Dread Knight doesn't provide that much value. Their creatures can get trample, and not only that, it doesn't even block like a World Wagon or something like that, and it can't attack into their stuff because their creatures are pretty much too big. The Trailblazer, at least you get like 1 point of damage in because it has 2 toughness, but that Dread Knight would just not provide value against a deck like this. So this kind of feels like what I need, just a bit more removal and a bit more hand disruption. But I did debate putting in Duress though, just to get the Devastating Onslaught. And the Devastating Onslaught is the win condition with this deck now. So I did debate putting in Duress just to try to find that card. And that is what I'm going to do. I'm going to take out the Surak because, again, their deck is not very interactive. Surak might not provide the value. Even though Surak can block a World Wagon, that's another reason why I wanted to leave him in. But play the Duress, try to get the Devastating Onslaught out of their hand. This opening hand is not bad, but it's not great. I can at least play the removal spells and stuff. I'm going to start with the tactics. I drew a Cub, which unfortunately I cannot play. It did feel like I could play the Cub and then play the Gene Pollinator, and then I would have access to black, but I just felt like it would be too slow. So get rid of the Railway Brawler in their hand. And now I don't really have much I can do, though. I just kind of have to wait, hold up Nowhere to Run and see what they do. But I did find a Bat, which I am going to play, even though they might not have anything. They didn't. They only had lands. So whatever, a bit of a weird start to the game here. And then of course, they top deck a Trailblazer right after I played my Bat. So whatever. But drawing a 3rd land for me was excellent. Play the Cub, Earthbend the Passage, hold up Nowhere to Run, attack with the Bat. This is perfect. So now they might just play the Esper Origins instead because they might assume that I'm holding up removal here. And that is what they did. So good heads-up play from my opponent there to recognize that's what I'm doing. And they found a Quantum Riddler, which they can hard cast next turn. So with them doing that, unfortunately that Blooming Mars does come in tapped, but now I think, is it better to just play Ouroboroid? Right, is it better to just play Ouroboroid and just try to go big? Because I can't remove their Quantum Riddler. I can't remove their Summon Esper. I can only remove their Trailblazer, but as long as I hold up black mana, they're probably not even going to play it. So, tough spot. Right, tough spot that I'm in. It also could be just make the board wide, right, with Gene Pollinator. So that's what I decided to do. Can hold up the Nowhere to Run. And they're also going to have extra mana here from the Summon Esper. So, you know, I think that it might have been better there to play the Ouroboroid. But I wanted to go wide. So they do play the Trailblazer, which I can obviously remove with Nowhere to Run. But I'm going to wait to see if they cast the Quantum Riddler, and then I can Nowhere to Run in response. They do go for the Quantum Riddler, so now I'm going to remove the Trailblazer. But unfortunately, in response, my opponent had us 3 steps ahead, and they're going to copy the Trailblazer. So this is a rough spot that I'm in now, because even if I remove one Trailblazer, they still have another one. Look at how many cards they're going to draw off this, right? They draw cards off the Riddler. They draw cards off of the Trailblazers. That was crazy, right? So, good on my opponent. You know, now they can warp the Winter Night Story. I mean, harmonize the Winter Night Stories. I mean, this is just like, wow, right? What a turn. What a turn from my opponent. So I drew an Unholy Annex, which makes things very interesting. I am considering actually opening up the Ritual Chamber here and having a blocker. And then I also feel like I should use Nowhere to Run on one of these Trailblazers because I have the Gene Pollinator, right? So as soon as I play this Annex, I can tap the Annex with the Pollinator to Nowhere to Run. So I can get in with the bats. And then I'm actually going to make a small mistake here because they're tapped out, right? I can cast a Nowhere to Run right now, but I wanted to wait on my opponent's turn to do it. And I don't really know why I did that. I don't know why did I even let them draw that card? I don't know. So why is this bad? Actually, you know what? I'm going to pause the video. Why is this a mistake? Why is it bad that I waited for my opponent's turn here to cast this Nowhere to Run on the Trailblazer? Because look how many cards they have. Was it like 7 or 8 cards or something like that? Like, there's a good chance that they have another counterspell, right? So, I don't know. I think it was a little bit egotistical of me to wait until my opponent's upkeep to cast a Nowhere to Run on the Trailblazer. I don't really know what I was thinking in that moment. Well, I guess one thing about casting stuff on opponent's upkeep is that if they want to respond, they have to tap their mana, and then they don't get that mana during their main phase, right? So that is kind of like something that I was thinking about, you know, that they might not be able to like cast a Quantum Riddler if they want to do something in response. But still, to take the risk that my opponent has a counterspell is a little foolish. You know, I feel like that was a very soft and loose play by me. And they do have a counterspell. They have a Spectral Denial. My opponent's going to play the Quantum Riddler, draw a bunch of cards off this. And then I'm actually thinking that I just need to take this damage. You know, I shouldn't block the Demon or the Cub. So, you know, really, that was highly detrimental, me not casting Nowhere to Run on my turn because I took an extra 6 damage. I drew a land, which is not bad. I can play the Ouroboroid. But I'm just going to have to pass. You know, I can't attack or anything, but not bad. I do have a wall of blockers here. My opponent warps a Quantum Riddler. They're going to draw 3 cards off this. And my opponent casts Devastating Onslaught on Trailblazer. So once they did that, it felt like, oh man, they're gonna draw so many cards off that, right? But I didn't actually need to scoop there. So I was a little bit shaken up in the match because I made the mistake with the nowhere to run. And I'm someone who's pretty adamant in a lot of my videos about not scooping early. You know, like whenever my opponent scoops early in the games that I play, I'm just like, well, don't do that. You know, the game wasn't over or whatever. And in that situation, the game wasn't over because I had blockers, right? I had blockers. And not only that, Ouroboroid's on the field, everything's going to get bigger. My Deep Cavern Bat that has lifelink is going to get bigger. I can open up the Annex and start gaining life because I have the Demon. So really, that was a preemptive scoop on my part. I didn't need to scoop there. I could block with my Gene Pollinator that was on the field. I could even block with my Cub at that point. So, I don't know. I'm a little disappointed in myself that I scooped there. I didn't really have to. So now watch this. This is exactly what I was explaining in the deck tech. Right? Watch what I do. Tap the Elf, then tap the land, and play the Badgermole Cub because I'm holding up black mana for Shoot the Sheriff. Right? That's why I did that. That's what I was explaining in the deck tech. Now, it would have been better if I had Deep Cavern Bat. Can you imagine if I had Deep Cavern Bat in this situation, take my opponent's thing when they're playing a combo deck, and I have a board of 4 creatures? Like, it would be pretty insane. But then when I was reconsidering this, I was like, wait a minute, they're not going to play a creature on turn 2, unless it's an elf. So why not play the other Badgermole Cub and go even wider, right? So now I have access to even more mana. And that felt like the better thing because, look, there's nothing on turn 2 that this Temur Battlecrier deck plays that is immediately threatened that I need to Shoot the Sheriff. And then now look at how much mana I have access to. I have access to 10 mana. All right, so what I'm doing is I'm just tapping my creatures and my lands and everything because I was trying to keep track of it in my head, but I was like, you know what, let me just tap it and see. Like, let me just see how much mana I have. So I just wanted to tap it just to make it a little easier on myself to keep track of how much I had. And it's 10, right? It's 3 black and 7 green. So I can not only play the Annex, but I can also open up the Ritual Chamber. This is all happening on turn 3. This is insane. This is absolutely insane. Annex and Ritual Chamber on the same turn by the 3rd turn of the game. Draw a card, drain my opponent for 2 life. I have a 6/6 flyer. I mean, I have lethal next turn anyway because of the 2 life from the Annex drain, right? And they just concede. Absolutely insane, man. What an insane turn 3 from this Golgari deck. So I think I could have played that match a little bit better though, right? There were a few mistakes that I made, especially in the second game. So I hope you all enjoyed this gameplay featuring Golgari Midrange. Again, I went for a different approach with this build, a little bit lower to the ground, a little bit less interactive, but as you would expect from Golgari, it is a little bit flexible. You know, the deck can go in a few different directions from the sideboard. And I'm sure you're wondering how the deck did. Again, I said that I played 10 matches. Here are the results, at least with this version of the deck. I did try other versions as well. And this is just the one that for me feels the best. This record is nothing crazy, but it definitely shows that yes, Golgari Midrange is a relevant deck in the current landscape. It can keep up with the other decks that are being played. And again, with my build, it's a different approach where I'm going for tempo. I'm going for tempo with the start, hopefully a start with one of these mana creatures, either Gene Pollinator or Llanowar Elves, and then a Cub. And then you can play one of these other 2 mana creatures. Again, the best start, the biggest tempo is turn 1 Elves or Pollinator, turn 2 Cub, and then also turn 2 Deep Cavern Bat. It just puts you so far ahead. Then you get your Annex or your Ouroboroid, and you're ahead from the 2nd turn. Again, like I said in the deck tech, I played 10 matches, but unfortunately a lot of them weren't really that interesting. I had matches where I did that. I turn 2 or turn 1 Elves, turn 2 Cub and Bat, and then like an Ouroboroid, and then that's it. My opponent just scooped, and then like the next game after that, they would just concede early, or they like missed too many land drops. So that match only took like less than 5 minutes or something. So I didn't want to put that in because that's just not really that entertaining. But really, this deck just has a lot of potential here. It can go extremely fast with the Elves, the Cub, and then something else in an Ouroboroid, and that might just win you the game outright. Or it can go a little bit slower and grind with the Annex, the Dread Knight, the removal, the Bat, all that stuff. This helps carry you into the late game. But I will just reiterate that there are a lot of directions that you can take with this deck. A more interactive approach where you play a lot of removal, a lot of interactive spells, you main deck Intimidation Tactics, or you main deck Duress or something like that. Or you can go for bigger plays with something like Luis. Again, I do think Luis is a really good option in this deck, but I explained in the deck tech why I chose to take him out. If you were to put in a couple copies of Luis, I think the main one to cut would be Mosswood Dread Knight. I think the Bat and the Demon Wall, based on this build with the Annex and everything, I think these are what you're going to want to keep. But then you could replace the Dread Knights with 2 copies of Luis. I will say that cards like Elves, Cub, Bat, Raven Eagle, these are just so good in the current landscape. So I definitely think you're going to want to find room for these. Definitely 4 Elves, 4 Bajimo Cub. I would really recommend 4 Deep Cavern Bat and at least a few copies of Raven Eagle. If you want to run Sentinel in the Name of City instead of Serac, by all means, you can try that. But this kind of shell that I put together here that somewhat targets the meta and also goes for more of a tempo-based approach, I would really recommend that you try this out and just change out a few pieces. You know, maybe you don't play Gene Pollinator, you play Intimidation Tactics, maybe you don't play Dread Knight, right? Maybe you don't play Serac, and you just change a couple of those things. But otherwise, try this kind of core, you know, the other things that I've mentioned, kind of like these Elves, Badger, Deep Cavern Bat, Ouroboroid, Annex, right? And then I would even say that like the Demon Wall and the Raven Eagle, try starting with just this and then the, you know, various removal spells, and then change out these other creatures for some other things and see how the deck does for you. That wraps this one up. It was very cool to put together just this pure mid-range value Golgari deck. And look, this is basically my wheelhouse, right? Like a lot of the decks that I put out, a lot of decks I make, they're mid-range decks. So this is kind of my comfort zone. And amidst all the crazy combos, you know, the Insidious Roots and all the other combo decks, and also the other Golgari combo that uses the Blood Gas and the Graveyard and stuff like that, it's cool that mid-range can hang. If you enjoyed, then drop me a like to beat the YouTube algorithm and leave me some feedback in the comments. What do you think about the deck? What do you think about the card choices? Have you tried Golgari mid-range yourself? And are there certain cards that you find didn't work or that do work really well? As usual, I really like seeing people's suggestions for the build in the comments because, hey, like, you know, I'm not claiming to be the all-knowing expert here. And if somebody comes and watches this video and sees what I have, but then goes to your comments and sees one of your suggestions, then they may try that in their deck and it ends up working really well for them. So I think that's cool to kind of have a communal effort here with multiple heads sharing their feedback and their input. To that end, if you are interested in finding more like-minded people to discuss decks or discuss Magic the Gathering with, then you can join my Discord server linked in the description. And lastly, if you are a fan of this kind of Magic the Gathering content that gets deep into deck building, play patterns, and other aspects of the game, then subscribe to the channel to see more. Thank you all so much for watching, and I will see you in the next video.